My contribution addresses one of the ambitions of the symposium, to think about some of anthropology's conditions of possibility, and possibly its inevitable interventions. I touch on 3 ethnographic situations where anthropologists have worked with professionals whose job is specifically to make interventions into people's lives. After some introductory remarks, a short thread is drawn out of them, and then some rather longer threads with a sort of knot at the end. This symposium gives an open and welcoming invitation to pursue threads of thought, and across material that lies outside anthropology as much as within. Thread not as a road to go down or a rope to hang on to, and without the regular patterning of warp and weft. I take a thread as something that can be caught, both caught hold of and getting itself caught onto what is in its vicinity. Although going somewhere because it's coming from somewhere, a thread gains what substance it has in becoming entangled with other threads, just as, or at the moment when, the entanglement, or the knots, seem to make further tracing impossible. Any particular thread of thought might appear as a singular twist, might seemingly take the form of a genealogy or archaeology, but in truth was never unknotted from innumerable others. If indeed what happens to a discipline on the inside is not detached from its communicative possibilities with an outside, are there areas of anthropological activity where this might be especially true? I catch the threads of 2 distinct, certainly ongoing discussions. First, in terms of concept formation, the nature-society or culture-society, culture-nature dyad seems forever subject to fresh criticism and reformulation, and forever to regain its influence. Secondly, this time in terms of engagement with human subjects, in quotation marks, anthropology has been as much heir to regimes of audit and self-scrutiny as it has shown their limits. Both areas have contributed to anthropology's self-formulation and to the kinds of knowledge it makes more widely visible. I note that both are also topics of huge interest to the English and Scottish versions of the European Enlightenment. This leap is a little more artful, I hope, than simply clutching at a straw, which would be no thread at all. I'm drawn by strong threads in that direction, by what I already know, to places in which I've already been entangled. Seemingly separate threads may indeed at one stage have been knotted together. The interest of the period, the 18th century Enlightenment, is for what it suggests about certain preconditions of anthropological reasoning that have made the 2 topics, self-scrutiny and nature-society, enduringly salient. Familiar to anthropological debates, these topics are equally familiar to humanities and social sciences in general, and beyond academia altogether. To keep discussion brief, I refer to some ethnographic situations where ideas springing from these 2 areas seem to have been carriers of interventions by anthropologists and others. To keep a parity of sorts, examples will come from current discussions of clinical practices in South America, although I should treat them at somewhat greater length. So first, a very short thread. Self-scrutiny. Description seems such a mundane activity for the text-based scholar that it's interesting to come across it as a focus of attention in other fields. Corson Jimenez's account of anthropological knowledge-making contains an extended discussion of a work on realism in 17th century Dutch painting. Had I been more artful, I would have found something finished and apologise. The art historian called her book The Art of Describing. We quickly learn that it was description in a special sense, the technique of making the observer disappear by dislocating the eye from a single viewpoint. And I quote, "The mobile eye of Dutch composition cuts the world two ways. It multiplies with one eye what it divides with the other, and in doing so opens up a space for a third form of vision, a seeing double that is more than one and less than many." Among several scopic regimes of modernity, it is one, and of course Hilja himself draws attention to the connection that might have been shared with the users of microscopes and optical experimenters of the time. The world seen microscopically, if you think about it, both multiplies the innumerable small elements within a larger body and, in enlargement, divides a small part from the whole. Painter and microscope user alike treated the eye as taking in the world. Quote again, "A split eye signals the birth of an aesthetic which consisted in making something visible, in being a pure apparition that made appearance appear from a position just on its edges." This is not the place to start undoing the many knots these writers have so skillfully tied, but conceivably we have here some of the conditions of possibility for what it was to be reconceived as a splitting of the self. In his discussion of the Enlightenment formulation of the self as a rational entity through being divided into two, the management theorist Hoskin picks up another thread. You see why you don't need to dwell on the names. Just carry on. Flow. There's some more names coming, sorry. The 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume, Hoskin says, proposed that the self becomes ethical by considering how one's actions are viewed by an impartial spectator. But let me give Hoskin's argument in full. The line he draws running through Hume from Thomas Hobbes a century before to Hume's contemporary, the political economist Adam Smith. And these are Hoskin's words. Where Hobbes had looked out through his perspectival window onto the foolish and selfish selves in the thought world beyond, Hume had attempted to construct a sort of reverse viewing from the thought world beyond back onto the self who views. Hume's formulation of the impartial spectator paints a picture wherein I become ethical by looking through my window on the world and seeing there's some moral other, the impartial spectator, whose surveillance of me ensures that I develop moral sentiments. On this reading, what Smith achieves is a step beyond this by discovering on the far side of the window a mirror self, the self that examines, which stands in for and replaces the other as judge of self. Now, Hoskins was articulating a historical trajectory that for him set the conditions of possibility for new forms of description. This was the description of performance to which measurements could be given, applicable to university examinations and financial auditing alike. The ethical self was the self-examining self. Other non-pictorial conventions of description were to develop, and at various times anthropologists have rehearsed all three positions, Hobbes, Hume and Smith, where the following notions of the privileged observer, of the relativity of the familiar and unfamiliar, or of course of discovering the self in the other. Where the philosophers were concerned with ethical formation, for the anthropologist, these positions point to diverse concerns with the accuracy or appropriateness of the social world so gained. Social, insofar as such knowledge rests on the kinds of relations the writer has with his or her subjects of study and fellow academics. Victorian fertility clinics and to the ethnography of Roberts shifts the axis of description. Roberts sustains a running contrast with attitudes derived from the European Enlightenment such as those found in 20th and 21st century Euro-American accounts of assisted conception. Among them is the kind of agency entailed in the once firmly held nature society, though she talks of nature culture, paradigm, whose starting point was that nature, to which the body belongs, is more or less an immutable given. Now, whereas the effect of Kelly's recourse to the topic, nature society, is to illuminate the way ideas held by the Venezuelan doctors are entwined with those of anthropological discourse, Roberts separates out these threads. What might be true of anthropological accounts of assisted conception in North America, say, is not a truth that holds across all the Ecuadorian clinics. Roberts argues that many, not all of them, many of the Ecuadorian clinics share with their clientele approaches likely to have their roots in religious categories based on pre-biological determinations of lineage, which were the precursor to present-day concepts of race. The continuing assumption that in Ecuador people can change their race. The continuing assumption is that in Ecuador people can change their race. Here is another descriptive intervention on the anthropologist's part. Its consequence is the weight to be put on the multiplicity and plasticity of the ontological world, she says. The phrasing, people can change their race, is intended to describe neither logical confusion nor social construction, but the ever-present possibility of ontological transformation, in her words. These people are participating in Ecuador's nation-making through what Roberts calls a national whitening project, a continuation of earlier whitening interventions, especially in the case of the poor or clients of Indian background. Simply to be the object of medical attention is transformative. Under the care of whites, as doctors and clinical staff categorically are, the client becomes white. Through IVF, Roberts says, women can become white producers through being cared for the way whiter women are cared for. This is based on a grounding assumption about the malleability of bodies and produces descriptions very different from those that the ethnographer can accomplish. There's something to be said about the kinds of relations at issue too. The epithet assisted before assisted reproduction takes on unexpected resonances. In this Catholic country, whose church frowns on fertility procedures, God is everywhere and an immediate, not a distant presence. God's giving of life is constantly brought home. But rather than it halting their activities, this presence is harnessed by the clinics. The scientific techniques that assist the procedures are also the means through which the clinical personnel assist God. In deliberately evoking common Euro-American notions, Roberts observes that they do not perceive themselves to be playing God, but rather as being God's helpers. Hierarchically speaking, patients in turn are assisted. The focus of assistance for many patients is less about the modification of the materials of fertility, IVF, egg or sperm donation, embryo freezing, than about the patronage bestowed on them. There is regional variation, but generally speaking, private medical clinics are similar to haciendas in that the relations are paternalistic, not consumer-oriented. Patronage is acted out in the clinic through all the social activity that is entailed in attending to the patient's health and comfort. The relationship of dependence is actively sought by many Ecuadorian women, and particularly, of course, Ecuadorian women with fertility problems. And Roberts writes, assistance, not autonomy, is the very basis of existence. The clinic demonstrates that the patient is worthy of care and of the patron's notice, and this is part of what makes them whiter. Now, is this a kind of pre-Enlightenment modernity that some Europeans of the time, 17th, 18th century, would have recognized? Roberts gives her own history of various Creole concepts that eventually became the basis of race, and it's a complex one, it's a complex history. However, a significant axis on which she clearly sees a departure from Enlightenment ideas, and she refers to them as such, is over the character of God's intervention in everyday life, as for example in enabling people to have children, and thus over understandings of nature. A non-interventionist God is another proposition altogether. And she quotes David Hume, whom we've already encountered, to the effect that a miracle would be a violation of the laws of nature. Now I come to something that might qualify as a not, but I'm not quite sure. The kind of description at which anthropology excels is expository, making an interpretive relationship with the world explicit. However lyrical or empirical the form, a view about understanding, which entails a world to be understood, is being expounded. Yet because different moments or aspects of elucidation come into view at different times, there is nothing new in saying that exposition is also an entanglement of descriptions from many hands. Thus, indeed, anything available to description is, of course, already described, a kind of precondition of anthropological knowledge-making. I mean, somebody has described it. This does not mean one has to put one's tools aside. It's been helpful to consider as interventions two clusters of concepts, one to do with self-scrutiny and the other to do with nature and society, that animate anthropological debate within, as well as flourishing on its outside, and germane to the kind of knowledge that anthropology makes visible. I've threaded them through three ethnographic occasions to make visible another facet of anthropological knowledge-making. The descriptive endeavour does not get very far without the invocation of social as well as conceptual relations. It's a truism, of course, that specific times and places yield specific descriptive genres. Yet perhaps there's something particularly interesting for social anthropology in some of the descriptions of the English-speaking world prevalent at about the time of the scientific revolution of the 17th century, subsequently to be sedimented in Enlightenment sensibility. Present-day anthropologists are thoroughly aware that much of their social knowledge consists in relating relations. That stance, relating relations, finds echoes in certain kinds, not all of course, of painterly and experimental optics, whose descriptive effect can be explained more generally as making appearance itself appear. It seems to be repeated in certain, of course all, philosophical musings on human nature that in the 18th century made explicit the notion of understanding. Appearance as an object of viewing, understanding as an object of reflection. Through specific ideas of I and mind, these become objects of description. But we've already slipped through the knots by which these two areas of discussion are tied together, and there's no need to tie them more tightly. Rather, we might ask if that other thread can be threaded in as well. Should we be asking about other conditions of possibility? Should the anthropologist be pondering on how relations become an object of description, and thus an object of knowledge too? And a very brief paragraph to conclude. An anthropologist might think it banal in the extreme to say that the threads of self-scrutiny in the nature-culture debate are tied together in relations. That is, in a presupposed ability to perceive relations as at once internal to these concepts and external with respect to others. But this is true of countless occurrences which seem to deflate the interest of any single set. Yet following these particular strands of thought captures and momentarily catches on some taken for granted banalities that intervene all the time in our descriptions of the world. Thank you.
Strathern's threads not only move across the globe, but also back in time. They catch hold of Yanomami and the Venezuelan doctors, Ecuadorian fertility patients, health service providers in Australia's Northern Territory, the ethnographers of all three, as well as 18th century philosophers. Focusing on two clusters of concepts that have been informed by anthropology, nature-society, and self-scrutiny, the paper refuses, however, a straightforward inside and outside the discipline story. First by turning the inside out, and second by catching up threads that link current, ongoing anthropological, but not only anthropological debates to English and Scottish versions of the Enlightenment. So I have a question about whether such shifts in senses of self that have been tracked to political and economic changes of the 1960s and 70s, of which David Graeber will have more to say later on, whether they constitute a transformation not of the same kind, but of the same order as that the Strathern charts for the 18th century, or are they variants of the same? My question is, are we still in late modernity?